First, I'd like to start by thanking everyone for being here. I know Charleston Pro Bono Legal Services is very excited about this event, having Dr. Gershenson here, and just talking about a large area of their practice and some of the things that they see. So again, thank you all for joining us. Before I get into my introduction, I'm going to kind of start with a couple of short stories. So bear with me if you will. So first one, 24-year-old mother of two is in need of immediate housing. As of this Friday, she will no longer have a place to stay. She's scheduled to start working with FedEx on June 1st, but she does not have transportation at the time, so Somerville, North Charleston area would be an ideal place for her to live so that she can get a ride to work each day with a coworker. Another story, someone said, "Good afternoon. The Hope Center is assisting a 78-year-old senior citizen who is in need of rental assistance in the amount of $685 for the month of May. If your organization can assist at all, please contact me." Another story, I have a client in need of $226 in rental assistance. I understand that many organizations may currently be out of funding, but if anyone has suggestions or can point me in the right direction, I'd greatly appreciate it. Last story, single mother with two children has a monthly rent of $1,800. Between her contribution, which is $830 from her temporary job prior to starting a new job, and a nonprofit organization that was assisting and gave $600, that gave her $1,430 for this month's rent, and she just needs then $470 to be able to get there. So close. The landlord agreed to waive all late fees if rent is paid by today. And if not, the landlord said he's going to go back and add late fees and file eviction paperwork. She just started this new job this week, working full-time, 40-plus hours from home, doing medical claims at $18.75 an hour. She expects to be able to cover rent going forward with the work income and taking advantage of available community resources such as food pantries to reduce other expenses, but she just needs a little bit of help right now. These stories that you've heard are some of the most recent postings from Trident United Way's Charity Tracker. It's a message board for service providers to share resources and ask for help. The requests are endless. There are many more here on this sheet that they told me that I could choose from. The problem of rent burdens a number of families in our area, particularly mothers and seniors, and it remains a constant issue here in the Low Country. If you have a secure home and a steady income, it may be hard to imagine the mental, physical, and emotional damage that occurs when the kind of uncertainty depicted in these stories that I've just read to you is your lived experience. Factors such as wages, educational opportunities, generational wealth, generational trauma, and access to land and housing complicate the matter beyond such simplistic commands as pay your rent, get a better job, move. So that's what brings us here today. I'll introduce myself with that. My name is Eris Hanchard Ferguson. I work as General Counsel for the Housing Authority of the City of Charleston. Our housing authority has about 1,280 or so public housing units. We've converted and have a little over 100 project-based voucher units. We administer over 1,400 housing choice vouchers. And uniquely, our housing authority has a private side of our portfolio where we operate it similar to workforce housing. We own it, so we set the rents a little bit lower than what the market requires so that we can meet people at the various levels of their income. I've been blessed enough to be at the Housing Authority for 5 years now and seen firsthand some of the stories that we've talked about. I was happy to be here when Charleston Pro Bono reached out and asked for me to moderate this discussion and really bring to the forefront some of the housing issues that we've seen over the last several years and some that we still experience even today. Our guest today has spent the last decade studying evictions. Carl Gershenson is the lab director at the Princeton Eviction Lab. He has he has published on the causes and consequences of housing instability, with a special focus on how eviction leads to further economic and residential insecurity. He received his PhD in sociology from Harvard University, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's in Boston, where his dissertation explored the political and cultural origins of the American Business Corporation. After graduation, Carl joined the sociology department at Washington University in St. Louis as a postdoctoral research fellow. Most recently, his work has focused on how the housing crisis affects children. And today, he's here with us today to share insights for the last 6 years of the Eviction Lab research, what progress they've made in the fight against evictions, and where we go from here on our journey. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gershenson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eris. Thank you, everyone, for being here. First of all, am I good without the mic? Can we hear me in the back? Thank you. So I got a chance to take a look at the guest list for all of you, and I feel really privileged to be in a room with so many wonderful people. A lot of people in this room doing amazing work addressing the housing crisis in Charleston, so thank you. And thank you to Charleston Pro Bono for inviting me, for putting on this event, for all the events of the last few days. They're heroes doing amazing work. So, just so happy to be here among all of you. To give some background on me and my work, I'm the director of the Eviction Lab. We were founded in 2018, and I'll get to that, but I'll give a little bit of backstory. The Eviction Lab was founded by Matt Desmond, the author of Evicted, and I met him when I was in graduate school. He was doing his field work in Milwaukee on evictions, and he had the foresight, as he was doing that field work, the foresight and the good luck of getting a very large grant, to field a survey in Milwaukee of low-income renters. It was one of the first surveys exclusively sampling low-income renters. And he brought all that data to me, as a young grad student who knew how to run a regression. And he and I published 4 papers together analyzing that data. It was the first quantitative study of evictions. And that work established a lot of the empirical regularities that he would talk about in his book that we continue to talk about in the lab, firmly establishing that eviction is not just a consequence of poverty, but is a cause of poverty. That once you experience housing instability, it is very easy to enter onto a downward trajectory, destabilizing a life that was once, maybe just a little bit above. You're treading water, you're no longer treading water, right? So we publish these studies. Matt goes on and publishes Evicted. It's a big hit, and people want to talk to us about evictions. We would go around talking about our findings, but I think to some extent at that period, evictions had become so synonymous with the city of Milwaukee that we would be talking to people in other areas, and they'd nod along and be like, oh, that's very serious, evictions are very bad. But it was hard to convince them that they should be dealing with evictions in their communities, right? And this just comes down to an issue of when you don't have hard data that you can just hold up in front of people to establish the scope, the severity of the problem. It's very easy for elected politicians, power brokers in local communities who have, there's hundreds of issues that they could be dealing with. They have scarce resources, like I know that, and if there's other people in their face, other people who are louder, they'll deal with those voices. So we needed data to really say, how big of a problem is this? Where is this problem? And that's the story behind the founding of Eviction Lab. Because we were looking around and we realized that no one was collecting data on how many evictions were occurring, where they were occurring. Were they going up or were they going down? And if you think about this, the data that we collect is really an indication of our collective values. What do we measure? I mean, the federal government spends a lot of money collecting data on GDP, unemployment, inflation, right? I can look up data series for housing starts. I can look up data for foreclosures. I know where to get data on what percentage of active mortgages are below 3% or above 7%, right? We really value home ownership. We have a lot of data on home ownership. Recently, the federal government has stopped collecting data on air pollution, CO2, right? That's a clear indication of where our values are. No one was measuring evictions, right? No one wanted to know how many renters were being forced out of their homes on any given year. So that's where we came in. But before I talk about the data we collected, let's start at the root of the problem. And this graph, I think, is the root of the problem. Renters' incomes have not caught up to rising housing costs. This is a graph going back to the year 2000. In that orange line, we see an ever steady increase in rents in this country. From the year 2000 to the year 2023, rents are up by over 23%. The blue line is median renter household income. So, quite shockingly, I think, and this is adjusted for inflation, but you see that renters were actually becoming poorer from 2000 to 2010, a decade of lost income while rents continued to go up. Now, things turn around in 2012, but that's just barely enough to account for the rent keeps going up, right? And then in 2020, rents skyrocketed, and you see income sort of stagnated there for renters. So we're now at a point where, compared to the year 2000, rents up by 23%, renter income up by 5%. That's a huge gap. Now, what about the safety net? Only 1/4 of renting families below the poverty line receive any housing assistance in this country. Housing assistance is not an entitlement like SNAP or like Medicare. So 75% of people who qualify for housing assistance get none. About 6% of people are in public housing, 12% of people on a voucher, 8% of people on assorted other programs, but 75% of people 75% of people below the poverty line rely exclusively on the private rental market for their housing. And that's how we end up in a situation where the majority of low-income renters are cost-burdened and even severely cost-burdened. This is data from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for South Carolina. It's broken down by income bracket. So on the far right, we have people earning 80 to 100% of a typical income in the state. And all the way on the left, we have people earning 0 to 30% of a typical income in this state. Now, the way housing scholars like to measure housing cost burden is what percentage of your income are you paying towards rent. The old adage was don't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. That is very difficult for people to do these days. So we have a new term called severely cost burdened. That's, are you spending over half of your income on housing? And if you look at our figures here, if you are earning between 30 to 50% of a typical income, about 75% of people are cost burdened. If you look at the extremely low income people, you have almost 3/4 of people are extremely cost burdened, right? Almost 3/4 of people earning that 0 to 30% of their median income are spending over 50% of their income on housing. Why isn't it 100%? Well, presumably that other 25% of people are the ones receiving some sort of federal housing subsidy, right? So everyone who's left on their own is severely cost burdened. Now, again, this is one way that housing scholars like to measure cost burden, right? What percentage of your income are you paying towards rent? But it's obviously missing a lot, because I would rather be spending 50% of a $100,000 income on my rent than I would be spending 50% of a $30,000 income on my rent, right? If you're spending 50% of your $100,000 income on rent, you're renting a nicer place, and you have a lot more money left over at the end of the month. So another question we can ask is, what do people have left over after they pay the rent? And a study from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard found in 2021, renter households making less than $30,000 a year have an average of $380 left over each month after paying rent. That's $380 for food, for clothing, for transportation, for childcare, for medical expenses. I think it's safe to say that these families don't have a rainy day fund, right? It's very easy to spend that $380 on all the other necessities of life. That means that these families are all one unexpected expense or one disruption to their income away from missing the rent and having an eviction filed against them. So when we launched our national map, where we had collected eviction records from across the country, geocoded them, placed them on this map, we found that in a typical year there were 3.6 million evictions filed. And they occurred everywhere in the country. I mean, there's some clear geographical patterns here that we'll talk about, but evictions were not an urban problem or a rural problem, not a blue state or a red state problem, right? They were affecting every community in the United States. When we launched this map, we also created a list of the cities in the country with the highest eviction filing rates. The New York Times picked up our data, ran a story, and so here is a screenshot from that New York Times article, which, I mean, you see Richmond, Virginia is bolded because the New York Times sent reporters to Richmond, Virginia, but you might notice that above Richmond, Virginia, the #1 city in the United States for eviction filings and eviction judgments. I guess North Charleston was not the #1 city for eviction filings, so it was Hampton, Virginia. But for judgments, it was North Charleston, South Carolina, and pretty close for filings. So this New York Times article is a large part of the reason why I'm here today, and we'll get to that. But I want to go back to this map for a second and just talk about what we can learn just from having mapped the data. One thing that immediately stands out to me, as a guy who likes looking at maps, is that, and I should say the size of these red circles is the eviction filing rate in every county in the year 2018. And the darker blue is the higher the poverty rate in a county. So one thing that immediately stands out to me as a guy looking at this map is you can see state borders, right? I see Alabama and Mississippi. I can see Georgia and South Carolina as one sort of blob right there. When you see state borders standing out clearly on a map like this, that tells you that state policy matters in affecting an eviction filing rate, right? And in a way, that is an optimistic thing. It tells you that the social problem is amenable to social policy. Something else that I see when looking at this map is eviction filings don't seem to be highly correlated with the rent, right? Like, where are the highest cost places in the country to rent? Like, California has a pretty low eviction filing rate. The whole West Coast has a low eviction filing rate. Like Massachusetts, that's a very expensive place. But there's also lots of places with, that are relatively affordable that have high eviction filing rates, like Mississippi, like a lot of the American South, like a lot of the Rust Belt, right? Like Indiana, upstate New York, Michigan. Those are places with high eviction filing rates. So this is not a one-to-one correlation with the rent. Actually, homelessness is very strongly predicted by housing costs, right? We know that the homelessness problem is the worst along the West Coast, in New York City, in the District of Columbia, but evictions seem to be predicted by something else. It's not poverty either. It's not strictly poverty, right? You see a lot of those places with like dark blue, or places with real high poverty rates, like look in South Dakota or areas of Arizona and New Mexico, along like the Texas-Mexico border. That's high poverty, low eviction rates. That's not explaining things. But I think that a lot of us who know, who can read racial demographics off of a map, you see that there's an eviction belt running from Maryland, Baltimore, DC, down the south coast, and then curving down through Georgia into Mississippi. And that runs pretty much along the lines of the Black Belt in the United States. So one thing that really stands out from looking at maps is you see that the geography of evictions and the geography of racial residents highly correlated. And there's sort of a fractal pattern to this racial geography. I used a map of Philadelphia because this is the city I'm most familiar with. We have these red shadings, right? If I showed this map to a Philadelphian and said, what do you think the red shadings represent? A lot of Philadelphians would immediately recognize, like the red, that's where primarily like the black residents of Philadelphia live. Maybe in the Northeast, that's a little bit where the Hispanic residents live, but the real white cells there, that's where the white residents of Philadelphia live, right? But this is actually eviction filings. There's something called like one true map theory that like urban scholars like to talk about, and it's no matter what social outcome you want to map onto a city, it's pretty much just going to map along the racial demographics of a city. And eviction filings are no exception. So that's what we can learn from maps. But we can't learn everything that we need to know about evictions from maps. So to dig further into the causes of the eviction crisis, the Eviction Lab partnered with the United States Census Bureau. So we have on our servers about 100 million eviction records. These are like, you can get these directly from court dockets, and they don't have that much information on them. They have like a name, an address, and a date. We uploaded these to a secure server in the United States Census and matched the names and addresses to administrative files. now that we were in that census environment, we could sort of recreate the households affected by each eviction filing. And we could also pool rich information on the demographics of those households, the income characteristics of those households, address history, and so forth. I mean, you can do so much once you're in that environment. This allowed us to create an extremely detailed demographic portrait of the evicted population. So what I'm about to show you next is an age and gender pyramid of the evicted population. So those 3.6 million evictions filed each year corresponds to about 7.6 million individuals, right? More than one person living in most households. And we found that about 40% of those affected by eviction are children. That's what we're seeing in this age pyramid, where the eviction filing rate is along the x-axis, that's the horizontal line. So the fatter the bar, the higher the eviction rate. And then as you go up, you're moving from, this is like babies and toddlers, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and so forth. We have eviction rates for women on the left, eviction rate for men on the right. So you see that fat bottom. That is children in this country experience about a 10% eviction filing rate. 10% of children in renter households are targeted by an eviction filing each year. You see those numbers get narrow for people in their 20s. I think that is primarily attributable to the fact that if you think about the typical life cycle, there are a lot of renters in their 20s who are high-income people who, when they enter into their 30s, maybe like late 30s these days, they become homeowners. But that means you're going to see like a lower overall eviction filing rate because that denominator includes relatively wealthy renters, right? But once those people become homeowners, rates get higher for people in their 30s and their 40s before rates begin to get low, and they're pretty low by the time you are a senior. One other thing that stands out here, these bars are relatively symmetric at the bottom for children. They're relatively symmetric for older adults, but you'll notice that the bars are larger for women than they are for men in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s. And why? These are the years in your life when you're most likely to have a child in your household, right? When we're talking about evictions, children are one of the strongest predictors of risk. In a recent study, we haven't published yet, but we wanted to look further, like what's this relationship between children and eviction risk? This is eviction risk broken down by number of children in the household and age at eviction. So this pink line running along the bottom is eviction risk for households with one child, and basically what you see, each additional child in your household is leading to increased eviction risk. Now you notice that here, these lines are like kind of flat until you get to the left over here. So newborns and toddlers may be slightly higher risk than older children. But what's really high is what we're calling -1 here. And this is, we figured out how to measure evictions in utero. The highest risk of eviction in your life is when you are in utero. So this is suggesting extreme discrimination against pregnant women, either in the labor market, in the rental market, or perhaps more likely, both. And that's a big effect. I don't know. That's a lot higher than the eviction risk at other ages. So when we cross these two major predictors of eviction risk, we have race, we have presence of children. What we see here is that you look at that bar in the middle, that's eviction rates for black households, black renter households. About 15% of black renter households without children experience an eviction filing each year. Now that's higher than any other race-child combination, except for black households with children in them. Over 25% of those households experience an eviction filing in any given year. So over a quarter of black children in renter households are threatened with an eviction in a given year. Now, why is this? You might say, well, we know that because of centuries of discrimination, black households have on average lower income than white households. But in this next figure, I'm going to say that is not the entirety of the explanation. And this is maybe my messiest chart, but it's also my favorite, so we're going to stop here a little bit, and I'm going to try to walk everyone through it. All right, on the x-axis, we have household income. from $20,000 a year to $80,000 a year. On the y-axis, we have our eviction rate. On the left, households with children present. On the right, households with no children present. The yellow lines represent eviction rates for white men and women. The purple lines represent eviction rates for black men and women. The gray line is the average rate. So, I think first things that we noticed, big pictures, are that the black eviction rate is a lot higher than the white eviction rate, right? We've already established that. If we compare the left to the right, we see that households with children have a higher eviction filing rate, right? We've already established that. But let's look at, for example, a black household earning around $60,000 to $80,000 a year compared to a white household earning around $20,000 to $30,000 a year. And the black households in our data have higher eviction filing rates, right? So again, this is a relationship that is not solely explained by income. You can also think about it, a black household with children earning $80,000 a year has a higher eviction filing rate than a black household without children earning $20,000 a year. These are just, one, stark reminders of the racial penalty when it comes to evictions, but also stark reminders of how much income you need if you are the guardian of a child in order to establish housing stability. Two other things that I think are interesting and worth pointing out here. We actually do break this out by gender, right? The darker purple is black women, and the maroon, I don't know, a bit of colors, is black men. The redder one is black men. But you see, they actually overlap quite a bit, and the same for the white eviction filing rates. And so when we talk about evictions being more common among women than among men, to a large extent, this goes away when you account for presence of children in the household, right? So all guardians of children are at higher risk of eviction. And the reason we see higher eviction rates among women than men is because, as we know, women are more likely to be guardians of children than men are. But really, anyone raising a child is at risk. One other thing that I like to point out is that there is a steep downward slope on the left here, and there's much less of a slope on the right here. So that's suggesting that for households without children, your income, I don't mean that your income doesn't matter to your eviction risk, but like something's going on here that isn't strictly accounted for by income. But right here, it's a pretty straightforward story that if you gave parents more money, they're going to have more housing stability, right? And again, just like when I could see the state outlines in that national map, and that indicated to me that, hey, there's a policy solution to this problem, this is another indication that, hey, there's a policy solution. Like, if you give people raising children more money, they're going to have more housing stability. Like, we see it in that downward slope right there. So, as disheartening as aspects of this graph are, I also like to see evidence that, hey, like, there are solutions that will work. So that is my overview of who, where, and when evictions are occurring. Now we'll move on to some research that we've done at the lab, establishing why this is a problem, why we should care about this. And I often realize when I'm giving talks like this, I'm in a room of people who don't need convincing, but you're all here, so I'm gonna try to convince you anyway. I think that when we first started this research, we were really pushing against sort of an idea that evictions were a discrete event in people's lives, right? Like your income got disrupted, you got evicted, it was a really bad March, but you're on your feet by April, right? Like it was a bad month, but then your life continues. And that's just really not the case for so many people who do experience an eviction. First of all, the most obvious effect of an eviction, you lose your home and property. This is a picture of an eviction cairn, as some people call it, an eviction cairn in New Orleans, right? So many people who, when they are evicted, especially if they don't have much time for move out, end up losing all of their material possessions, right? If you're a low-income family, that represents a considerable investment, and all that stuff being hauled off to the junk right there. We can also show in our data and through qualitative research that so many people, after they experience an eviction, don't have time to find a new apartment to lease up, right? I'm sure like in places like Charleston, vacancy rates are low. It's going to be even harder to find an eviction or to find a new place to lease up when you're scrambling especially if you don't have much time until move out. You have an eviction on your record. There's obviously a lot of other stuff going on in your life. So people experience sort of degrees of homelessness. A lot of people end up spending way too much money in short-term rentals and motels and so forth. Those are extremely expensive. Other people have spells living in their cars, doubling up on the couch of a relative or a friend. These are all stressful living situations to one degree or another. Also, very often not appropriate for children or not room for children. So another common experience filing an eviction is family separation, where some children go to live with a grandmother, other children go to live with an aunt, and that is obviously stressful, traumatic for families to experience. But even after a person finds a new place to lease, this is still just sort of the beginning of a period of prolonged housing instability. Again, we have a lot of survey research. We have a lot of data backing this up, that the first place that you rent after an eviction tends to be in a higher crime, higher poverty neighborhood than the home that you vacated. And it tends to be in a house that has more housing code violations. We asked people to list all of the possible housing code violations in the place they lease up after the eviction, and you see higher rates of the HVAC doesn't work, the windows are broken, exposed wiring, pests, things like that. You might say, well, at least they're saving money because they're living in a poorer neighborhood with worse housing quality. In our data, that wasn't the case. We actually found that 60% of people reported paying equivalent rent or higher to the place that they were evicted out of at their next lease up. And that's just an indication of how compressed rents are at the bottom of the rental market, right? Housing scarcity is so severe at the bottom of the rental market that there's not bargains out there to be found. Something else that we were able to show in our research is that evictions can lead to loss of income, both through job loss and loss of benefits. And why is this? Where you were previously living may have been convenient to, you could walk to work, or you could catch the bus to work, or you had a social network, someone could watch your kids, right? Now you're moving, you're on the other side of town, and you have to get your kids to school and then to your place of work, or you're just going through a lot. You're stressed, right, with everything you're going through. Maybe you're temporarily not as good of a worker as you used to be. There's a lot of different causal mechanisms that you can draw, but something that we see very strongly in the data is that people get evicted, they're much more likely to lose their jobs in the months following because of the disruption to their lives. Also, loss of benefits. We can show that if you think about it, after an eviction, you presumably have higher material need than you did in the year before your eviction. You would think you'd be more likely to enroll in programs like food stamps, but instead we see a sharp drop-off in food stamp receipt. And we think that one reason is because to be sort of like a full citizen in this country and to get all of the benefits of our social welfare system, you need a stable address, right? A stable address is the way that you get access to so much in our system. Once you are unhoused or bouncing from place to place, it's so much harder to maintain these benefits. Now we know that 40% of people who experience an eviction are children, and we have been able to link eviction records to school records to see how this affects children's educational outcomes. We know that evicted students are more likely to relocate to segregated schools with fewer resources, more student turnover and lower test scores. We know evicted students experience more absences and more suspensions. And I think whenever we think about children, we talk a lot about building generational wealth, right? You want to become a homeowner to build generational wealth. But so many renters, especially low-income renters, their housing situation becomes a method of perpetuating intergenerational disadvantage, right? These are children whose schooling is suffering. We're also able to link evictions to their mental health, their physical health, that is suffering. And maybe one of the starkest indications of this is we were able to link eviction records to birth records. And we found that when women experience an eviction in their second or third trimester, they are much more likely to have a premature birth or give birth to low-weight newborns, and their newborns are likely to have extended stays in the neonatal intensive care unit. Now, fortunately, medical technology being what it is, a whole lot of people go on, bounce back, thrive after having a disadvantageous birth. But these are children who are literally like already born behind their peers and often into situations where they don't have all those benefits that are going to help them thrive and catch up. So, I mean, this is the starkest possible way to present housing instability transmitting generational disadvantage from the moment you enter this earth. One final way to talk about, like stark outcomes, right? What's more final than death? We can show that housing loss costs lives. So we were able to link eviction records to mortality records maintained by the Social Security Administration. Now, during the pandemic, there was a lot of attention to housing as a fundamental determinant of health, and that's absolutely correct. During the pandemic, people who experienced an eviction had mortality rates 106% higher than before the pandemic. Compare this to otherwise similar renters, right? So like renters who have the same income, race, zip code, but who did not experience an eviction, they only saw mortality increase by 25%. I don't have this exact number off the top of my head, but like the increase in mortality for homeowners was something like 4 or 5% during the pandemic. So, I'll just keep repeating myself again, like housing situation is just a fundamental determinant of health, the way that our society is organized. This is true outside of the pandemic. We can show that during normal times, receiving an eviction judgment is associated with a 40% increase in mortality over a period of about 5 years compared to other people. And even if you're not evicted, we were able to look at mortality rates for people who just saw their rent burdens go up. And your rent burden can go up for a lot of reasons, right? Like you could move from like Oklahoma to Los Angeles, and now you're paying more for your rent, but that's not necessarily, maybe that was a good move for you. I don't know. But other people, you can think of like 2 people who did not move over a period of 20 years, but one lives in a neighborhood where rent went up, and one lives in a neighborhood where rent didn't go up, right? We compared mortality outcomes for those 2 people. Both those people didn't move, but now one person is spending 50% of their income on rent, and the other person is still spending 30% of their income on rent. And mortality rates went up by 11% for the people who saw their rent burdens go up. So, go all the way back to that first chart I showed you about renters. Everyone is spending higher percentage of their incomes towards rent. That's having an effect on the health of the American populace, right? It's a serious problem that demands we address it. So where do we go from here? We'll talk a lot about that at the Q&A, I'm sure, but just put some preliminary thoughts here. Federal policy, we are in a position where we need to defend dramatic cutbacks in housing choice vouchers, public housing, and fair housing law enforcement, right? Those are all programs that are under threat. Now, the low-income housing tax credit program is maybe like the only affordable housing program in the country that has bipartisan support. I was just looking up in the big budget that just passed the House, LIHTC expanded. It expands every year. Housing wonks think it's like the least effective and least efficient of our affordable housing programs, but it's also the one that keeps growing. So, do with that as you will. There's also a lot of talk in Washington about supporting children, supporting families. As I've tried to make clear here, children are at the center of the housing crisis, and it is a reminder that when we talk about housing policy, maybe we should also be thinking about good family policy, right? Anything that we do to support children and parents is on net also going to improve housing outcomes for people. Well, those are all the expensive programs that you need the federal government for. What can we do at the state and local level? Preserve existing affordable housing. However you can do that, is super important. One method that is used a lot in places that are experiencing rapid gentrification is community land trusts. That's the idea of sort of buying up property in areas right outside the gentrification frontier, reserve them for affordable housing before that neighborhood becomes unaffordable. I looked it up. There are community land trusts active in Charleston. I don't know which are good, which are bad, so I'm not going to name drop any. I don't have that local knowledge, but it's a model worth looking into. We can discourage unnecessary evictions, right? And we can talk about ways to do this, but look, the rental market more or less functions in every state in this country, right? But some states have 3% eviction filing rates, some states have 15% eviction filing rates. I mean, I think that's telling us that not every eviction is necessary for rental markets to function, right? So how do we discourage evictions where they are not necessary, right? We can talk about solutions there, and I think that our host, Pro Bono Legal Services, really have a lot of experience doing things like that. We can defend against illegal evictions, right? This isn't the majority of evictions that are filed, right? Most evictions are filed for cause, usually because someone has missed the rent. Again, the crisis is because of housing unaffordability, but there are a number of evictions that are filed where tenants' rights are being abused. Maybe the warrant of habitability is being violated. If landlords are not holding up their end of the bargain, it's important to have legal counsel to help defend tenants' rights. Emergency assistance for renters with temporary needs. This is something that is, I think, possible for local governments to fund. It's not permanent housing assistance like the Housing Choice Vouchers program. That's very expensive. You probably need the federal government to step in there. But people who have experienced temporary disruptions to their income or their car broke down, they have a one-time expense, this is where much smaller emergency assistance programs can really help people out a lot, help them from falling into that hole, helping them prevent their lives spiraling out of control. And finally, I think it is good to think about programs that reduce harm for tenants who will have to move, right? Not every tenancy is ultimately going to be viable, especially if someone's income situation has changed permanently. And I have all these studies showing how damaging an eviction is to someone's life. But it doesn't need to be that way, right? That's just the way our rental markets are organized, that an eviction is that disruptive. We can think of so many things that we could do to lessen the impact of an eviction. You could have housing service navigators who would help connect people to resources to place them in a new home. You could seal eviction records, making it easier for people to lease up in the future. You can, just one simple thing is giving people more time to move out after they get an eviction filing, right? Like if you look at people's outcomes after an eviction, how much time they have to move out is just like an enormously influential factor. And I want to end this talk by, I think Jerry scolded me a little bit last time I presented for ending on such a down note. So I'm going to try to be a little more uplifting here. We'll see if it works. Evictions are this very stubborn problem, right? This is our data from 2000 to 2018, looking at eviction rates in Milwaukee, Cleveland, Philadelphia. Notice those are really flat lines, right? There's just like 2 decades of eviction filing rates not changing. This is surprising. A lot happened in those 2 decades. We had a great financial crisis that was centered in rental markets, right? We saw deindustrialization of vast swaths of the country. We also saw rapid gentrification in any number of inner cities. Despite all of that, look, the eviction filing rates are just flat. It's a super stubborn problem. But also, there was not much policy innovation during this time. There were not a lot of people putting their heads together trying to reduce the eviction filing rate. So what has happened in the last 5 years? Well, not good stuff in the Sun Belt cities. These are increases in eviction filing rates in Las Vegas, Gainesville, Florida. Minnesota is not a Sun Belt city, I know, but just ignore that one. Houston, Nashville, Fort Worth, Jacksonville, Tampa, Memphis. Evictions have been going up between 2000 and 2025 in all of these places where people were flocking towards during the pandemic. These are places that used to be good bargains, and now they're not. There's not really a good bargain left in the US in terms of rental markets. But Charleston, I think, can be qualified as a Sun Belt city. Charleston has also seen a lot of people moving here. Charleston has also seen rents go up. But Charleston stands out as one of the few places in the country that has actually dramatically reduced eviction filings. So we have New York, Richmond, which is also, that was number 2 on our list, and also a lot of activity there fighting evictions. Philadelphia, Charleston, number 4, had a 30% reduction in eviction filings if you compare 2019 to 2025. And that is, thanks, I think, to so many of the people who are currently in this room, right, who saw a problem and took steps to address it. So that's the hopeful note, I want to end on. This is a problem that we have collectively created, and that also means it's a problem that we can collectively solve. Is that it? Or?
All right, so now we're going to turn to the fun part, question and answers. Dr. Gershenson and myself will sit over here. We received some questions ahead of time. But then we'd like to open it up to the audience, if you all have any questions. Kind of going off of what you were just talking about, looking at some of the changes that have come over time in some of the cities. Is there data that indicates any clear difference in outcomes for tenants in public housing versus private landlords? And then equally, does being a voucher holder put you at an additional disadvantage?
Yeah, so if we break down that question, being a voucher holder does tend to put you at a disadvantage in finding a place to lease up. We know that there is discrimination against voucher holders when it comes to finding a place to live. But we do have studies, not by Eviction Lab, there's actually other scholars out there doing good work, who linked eviction records to housing choice voucher records, LIHTC information, and public housing authority information. And eviction rates are definitely lower in public housing and for people who have housing choice vouchers compared to otherwise similar renters in the private rental market. So public housing authorities have high eviction filing rates and are generally going to be the largest evictor in any given city, but that is almost predetermined because public housing authorities own a lot of property and they serve a low-income population, thus the high filing rate. But if you compare the outcomes of those people compared to what they would experience in the private rental market, everyone is better off being in a subsidized environment. Except these studies also find no benefits from being in LIHTC, at least in terms of eviction filing rates. So, that LIHTC might be good in that it increases the housing supply or maybe it reduces your rent burden a little bit, but it is not protective against eviction.
That makes sense. I mean, LIHTC properties end up operating more like a conventional property than they do a subsidized program. So while they get the help to be able to build that affordable housing, it doesn't necessarily translate into keeping those folks in affordable housing. So we can kind of see that a little bit at the housing authority. I would like to say, and not just from my own thought as an attorney for the housing authority, but so from what my colleagues tell me at the Charleston Pro Bono Legal Services, because we do have a housing court program here. So after the study that came out in 2016, 2017 that you showed the numbers for, our judiciary started a housing court pilot program. Charleston Pro Bono Legal Services leading that up. South Carolina Legal Services is also contributing to that. And what it does is it aims to provide an attorney for the residents at the ejectment hearings. And so a lot of times we're able to come up with some type of alternative solution or some type of resolution or settlement so that we're not having to move forward with eviction. They have told me that we as a housing authority and as a landlord end up being a lot more flexible than some of the private landlords. I think that a lot of that stems from the fact that as a housing authority, we're in the business of housing. And so we recognize not only the clientele and the income demographic of the population that we work with, but also recognize that we don't really do a public good if all we're doing is evicting people. So that makes sense that the data shows that subsidized housing, people kind of can end up staying in that more. To your point about vouchers, I can definitely say that our housing authority and the other two housing authorities around, housing stock is always the issue with the voucher programs. Having enough private landlords that are willing to allow vouchers to come and rent their units is where we see the largest problem. We allow 90 days for our people that have been issued a voucher to look for housing, and it is sadly more oftentimes than not that 90 days is not enough time for them to find a place, and they run the risk of their voucher expiring in that time because they're not able to find something fits within the means. That is a plug that if you or someone you know has a unit that you don't mind renting, it is a great opportunity to be able to put it on the voucher program. And as you said, then those that can translate into a little bit more stability because those numbers show a little bit less. One thing that you were talking about earlier before we kind of moved to some other questions, I kind of wanted to throw out there, you were talking about the income ranges. And so I, pulled up and looked at what those area median incomes are for Charleston.
We always talk in AMIs, that's so terrible.
Right. So AMI, for those that don't know, is area median income. HUD ends up doing data research every year to decide what the area median income is in a metropolitan area. I was a little surprised, maybe I hadn't looked it up in a little bit, because I was going to get up here and say that a single person in Charleston to be at the median income would need to earn about $75,000 or so, but from what I looked up, and I'll obviously verify, that is starting to actually look more on the upwards of $100,000 end. I see Gianna nodding her head in the back. So she does, this is the Director of Housing and Community Development for the City of Charleston. So I know with her nod that those numbers are probably pretty accurate. So to think about that, that means a single person here in the Charleston area to be at the median income needs to be earning upwards of $100,000. And we know so many people that make far less than that. So when you're talking then about families and to the demographic of, you said, single mothers, that type of stuff, they are, what they need to be able to keep up is far less than what they actually make. So that just kind of puts in perspective some of those numbers. So with that, is there a correlation between an area having better public transportation and less eviction rates?
So there's a really cool study that was done by some researchers at University of Pennsylvania, and they were able to map the distance from the address where people were evicted to like the nearest bus stop or subway line. And they could tell, like, how long does it take you to get to housing court riding public transit. And the longer your ride was to get to housing court, the more likely you were to experience an eviction judgment. So, people making a decision, how much time should I take out of my day to go to housing court, defend myself in the case of an eviction filing. A lot of people are choosing not to, and then they get the default judgment, which is a much worse outcome for them. So access to, also, you asked about transportation. Childcare is a part of this too. If, hard to get childcare, are you going to drag your kids on the bus, on the subway to go to housing court to have your hearing? So that's one issue. But I think that something else that I've just noticed, I'm an avid consumer of long-form reporting on the housing crisis, right? I read every story about, working homelessness and things like that. And I just really noticed that these stories are always framed as stories about housing. But if you read them, the downward spiral started often before the eviction. It was when their car broke down. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have money for car repairs, you can't get to work. Or maybe you spend your money on car repairs instead of the rent. All sorts of ways that this can go, but we live in a country where your car is so central to can you function as a full member of society, that was at the root of what became extended periods of homelessness for these people. So, we do have a housing crisis. I also think we have a transportation crisis.
Yeah, I would echo that, 10 times over. Just looking, at not even just the clients that we serve at the Housing Authority, but just people that I know, friends or associates, they have a car breakdown. A young lady that I knew, she lived in Latson area. She works at Gildan, the textile company, which is, for those of you around here, know that it's off of Clements Ferry. So that's kind of, Daniel Island, Mount Pleasant-ish type, that type of area. For you that is not as familiar, that is a good 30-minute drive.
Okay.
And so when her car broke down, she was actually when she couldn't get rides with coworkers, she was getting Ubers. And we see that, clients that come in and say, oh, I don't have transportation, so I'm calling an Uber. And we all know, anybody that's used Uber or Lyft, there are surge prices. and they are able to get more, in the morning time when people might need them for, a commute. And then in the afternoon, anybody that lives around here knows what traffic looks like in the afternoon trying to get anywhere. So even if they're not surge prices, maybe your commute is, which would typically be 30 minutes, is now an hour and 15 minutes in traffic, and you've got to pay that time that the Uber is, on the road. So transportation can end up being a large barrier, because when you think about the income that people receive and then how much they then have to expend on Ubers, a ride share, to your point, it just starts eating away at what they have. So the problem is not even in difficulty getting to housing court, but it might even be difficulty in getting to the job to earn the wages that you need to begin with. So it does end up being very interconnected.
Right, because again, that study from Harvard that showed $380 left over at the end of the month after paying rent for people earning $30,000 or less. And that's not a lot of Uber rides.
No, not at all. To that point about when we were talking about area median income, we said upwards of 100,000 for a single person to be at median. So what that means, someone that is less than 30% of that, you're talking about them making only about $31,000. Someone that's in that 50 to 80% is anywhere from 50 to 80 or so $1,000. And then someone that makes even just a little bit above the median income that might make maybe 120%, that's $126,000. And while we hear that number and we're like, oh, $126,000, can be, it seems like it could be good money depending on what those expenses are, transportation, childcare, and the like. You may be spending a large amount of that. So when you look at some of the lower incomes, it really is not a large amount of wages to then have to spend on a number of different in a different number of different places. Do you think that the attitudes about the ethics of eviction affect eviction rates?
I think they do. I think that, one, there's always awareness of this issue among communities that were experiencing high rates of eviction, right? People would experience it themselves. Like they had strong opinions on eviction. But I think that in the last 10 years, we've seen people who have been isolated from that paying a lot more attention to this issue. But I also think that it's not just about people's ideas about the ethics of eviction, but ideas about the inevitability of eviction. I think that maybe it was easy for people to think about eviction as almost like a law of nature, like water runs downhill, and if you can't make the rent, you get evicted, or something. People would say, are you going to try to push water uphill? What are you trying to do, stopping evictions? But one, we have those maps. We know how much variability there is across the country in terms of eviction filing rates, right? We don't have this map open anymore, but remember, Alabama has a really low eviction filing rate. And Alabama is demographically and economically not that dissimilar from Mississippi and Georgia and South Carolina, yet Alabama has a really low eviction filing rate, right? So state policy matters.
What's that state policy that Alabama has that keeps their evictions low is what in comparison to other places?
Yeah, this is a fun one, getting into the weeds. We think it's their eviction filing fee. It costs $300 to file an eviction in Alabama.
All the lawyers in here are like, oh, that's what it is. That's it.
Yeah.
Problem solved.
And I think it's $30 in South Carolina.
$40.
$40.
Yes.
Okay. So that's one of the lowest in the country. And if you look at our map, places that stand out, New York State and Michigan have low filing fees, and they have high eviction rates, right? Florida has a $150 filing fee, and it's a much lower eviction rate than Georgia and South Carolina. Filing fees and eviction filing rates have a very strong correlation.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, it is $40 to file an application for ejectment here in the state of South Carolina. And in terms of the process, there is a court form. You can go on, print it out. It's got 3 check boxes that you have to write your name, the landlord's name, tenant's name, and then 3 check boxes, either the rent has not been paid when due, the lease has ended and they are technically a holdover tenant, or a lease violation. And that's just 3 lines that you can fill in. You don't have to fill it in order to file your application for ejectment. So when we talk about ease of being able to file, to your point in South Carolina, not only paperwork wise is it very easy, but then cost wise, it ends up being quite less. And in comparison to, for those that don't know, $40 to file evictions, $80 to file any other small claims matter. So same court, going to magistrate court, but $80 for small claims, compared to circuit court. If you're going to big court, as they say, $150 to be able to file there. So you are talking, even within our own court administration system, filing an application for ejectment is the cheapest thing that you can do with the court.
And I always want to emphasize, I didn't fly here from out of state to say what the exact ideal filing fee is for the state of South Carolina.
Of course.
I don't know exactly what the right filing fee is, but
maybe not $40.
But maybe not $40. And a fun thing to do, or at least maybe some people would find this fun, do a deep historical dive to figure out why is the filing fee $40 in South Carolina and $300 in Alabama. And you're not going to find that a lot of people sat down and did a big study and determined this was the right rate. It was just a sort of historical accident that some places have high filing fees, some places have low. So all I'm saying is sit down, reconsider it. Maybe we'll find that the right fee is something different than $40.
I would bet every dollar that I have right now to say that in South Carolina it is that number, because we decided that back in 1822,
yeah.
And it has been has been that ever since. So with that, questions that you all have in the audience, we've got a couple other things up here, but we really want to hear from you. Okay, I've seen some hands go up. I'm gonna start here and come around. Michael.
Hey, my name's Michael Gershenson. One of the things you mentioned on your slide about state-level mitigating harm was to discourage evictions. It was preserve affordable housing, discourage eviction, defend against illegal eviction. But what do you mean by discourage evictions? What does that mean?
Yeah.
I think filing fee would be part of that answer.
Filing fee was something that I was thinking of there. But so here's another one, which, from what I gather, is not as much of an issue here as it is in some other states. But let's take New Jersey, which has several serious problems. New Jersey has a very high eviction filing rate, despite, every elected official there would tell you that it's a very pro-tenant state, et cetera, et cetera. But one problem, huge backlogs in the courts. So when you file for eviction, it might take 5 or 6 months for your case to get to court. So landlords will very proactively file for eviction. They might not think they ultimately want to remove that tenant, but better safe than sorry. Just get that in the system. So by underinvesting in the court system there, you are incentivizing really active, too active eviction activity. Another thing New Jersey does is there are all sorts of social services that are only accessible if you show up with an eviction filing in hand. So you will have legal aid lawyers correctly telling tenants in New Jersey, invite the eviction. Only then can we help you. And I think that is not the best policy design.
Do you find that predatory filings or serial filings is also an issue?
Yeah, and I think that I think the filing fee is one of the biggest deterrents to serial filing, because those fees add up if you're filing every month against someone. And I think that once you sort of reduce the eviction flow, it makes it easier for all the stakeholders to sort of get a handle on the system, right? It's easier for the courts to deal with the case flow, less of a backlog there, easier for legal aid providers to figure out, how can we serve these people and so forth. You just make the system a lot more manageable by discouraging a lot of those, let's say, too proactive eviction filings.
Yeah, that makes sense. We end up having an issue here in Charleston where, because rent's due on the 1st, it's late after the 5th, you will see landlords filing routinely the 6th of every month when they don't get it. So yeah, that makes sense. Another question over here.
Good morning. Jermaine Husser with Our Lady of Mercy Community Outreach Services.
Yeah.
Here. My question is around personal responsibility. Are there studies that show where our neighbors that are being evicted some type of profile that shows where our neighbors are spending their money. And I know we talk a lot about a car repair or something of that nature, but I know for me in my own household, I don't always spend my money where I need to budget-wise, which does then create this whole domino effect that could lead to an eviction. Are there studies that show where our neighbors are spending their money for an organization like ours that can help empower our neighbors that, these behaviors or these trends show that you may be a candidate, a neighbor soon that could be one of our evicted neighbors, as well as the relationship between the landlord and the renter. How was that during that time frame? So I've been in that position before, and I ran away from my landlord because I didn't have the money. And I know that created tension and challenge that I could have probably helped heal or ease the situation if I would have been just communicating.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any studies on, as you put it, where people are spending their money. I would say that, for the lowest income tenants, where they have the $380 left over at the end of the month, they don't have that many decisions to make about where to spend the money if they're going to make the rent, right? Like, this might be sort of this discretionary spending might be more of an issue for people at higher income brackets. But I think that I want to focus on the last point that you brought up, which is when people begin experiencing problems, what do? And we're always very clear that it's best to engage with your landlord before the problems get bad. I think a lot of people do have an instinct it's like, to turtle. It feels good. It's protective. But the landlords hold the cards, so talk to them sooner rather than later. Talk to legal aid sooner rather than later. Figure out what options you have. You can start getting applications for emergency assistance, again, sooner rather than later. If your situation really is becoming untenable, work out an escape strategy sooner rather than later. Doing all of those things, they're really going to improve your long-term outcomes. So I think it's not quite what you asked about, like, responsibility with spending, but I think if you can encourage people to be sort of responsible about their longer-term life planning. It's hard because you're going through so much. You want a turtle, but you let people know there are resources out there to help them think this through a little bit more strategically, and that can really improve their outcomes.
Yeah, I would say on a little bit on like the social warm and fuzzy side of it. I think in some of those instances, to the point of maybe trying to aid that personal responsibility. I'll have tenants that, we're in court and we're talking about issues, and they just assume that because I'm an attorney that I make enough to not have to worry about the same things that they have to worry about. And relating to them to say, no, I mean, I'm in a dual income household. My husband's an attorney also, but we have to make decisions about where we spend and how we spend our money. I think sometimes the stigma of it keeps people from wanting to share or ask questions. And then sometimes equally that same stigma keeps people from at least willing to open up about how they go through the same things. You're not unique to this just because you might make lower wages. So maybe that also is ways to start having conversations and opening up to say, all right, let's budget, let's family plan a little bit better, a little bit differently, and not doing it from a place of, I'm here looking down and telling you what to do, but hey, here's what I've had to do being in a similar situation and having to navigate through some of these things. Because I mean, tenants, when I tell people that I work downtown on Meeting Street, but we bought a house in Cane Bay in Somerville, people are like, really? Yes, if we wanted a 786 square foot, $500,000 house on the peninsula, I mean, we could have done that. But I mean, we probably wouldn't still be married because I couldn't live with him in only 786 square feet. So I mean, there's things like that. So people just assume that it's only them that's going through it. We do have time for, depending on how long, I might be able to get to both of you. So we got maybe 2 more questions, but I'll start Liz and then Gianna.
Hi, my name is Liz Morrison. I just did HUD-backed properties, and so one of the things we run into And you mentioned about reducing the harm of the eviction process is sealing evictions. And I'm curious how that works and if you've noticed if any cities or states have something in mind where they implement that, because I know that's one of our biggest concerns when we have to evict someone is if you don't leave, it's going to end up on your record and it's going to hurt you in the future. So I'd be really interested to hear how that works.
So I'm aware of a lot of states doing it in different ways. So I think California maybe has the most aggressive approach where all eviction records are sealed immediately. So that's going to take care of it. Other places, I think like in Minnesota, it depends on the outcome. Like you can't access filings, but then if there is an adverse judgment, then that's accessible. And you know, that helps. So many people have filings that don't end up in a judgment. That does insulate a lot of people. Other places, I think it's that like the filings disappear from the system after a certain number of years. And now a tenant screening company could still have scraped the dockets and maintain that information, and then they sell those records to potential landlords. So this is not a foolproof strategy, but if a landlord goes directly into the court system and types in that tenant's name, that eviction record isn't going to come up. So you know that allows it to roll off. One other policy I'll mention is Philadelphia has something called the Renters Access Act. And this might work better in theory than in practice, but if you apply for rental housing and you're rejected by the landlord, you have a right to know why you were rejected. And if it does turn out that it was because of an error in a tenant screening report, this law gives you the right to go in and correct that issue. Because we know there are a lot of errors in tenant screening software. This is like especially problematic for people with common names. People are linked to the wrong eviction records all the time. And there's like one study just like, I guess there are fewer unique first name, surname combinations for Hispanic people than for white or black people. And so this is like especially a large problem for Hispanic renters, that they're all the time being associated with the incorrect people. So the Renters Access Act is a way to address that. But again, I don't know how many people actually take advantage of this, because you need a certain amount of sophistication to sort of bring that appeal all the way through to the end.
Wonderful. It's the same. Because we do have one more question, Gianna, I'm gonna try to grab you so that we can, right before we wrap up, but you had a question?
Sure. I was interested in best practices, and I think you've mentioned some. So we know some of the challenges we have in our state relative to evictions. What have you seen in your work that could help us or that we could apply to best practice in another community?
I'm glad I waited you for last. That is a great note to end on. So yes, Dr. Gershenson, best practices, maybe some things we can do that are easy to implement. Okay, touche, easy. I'm putting it in quotes. I mean, it's South Carolina, and we know nothing moves too fast.
So, I think that one thing that we've seen is, so eviction rates are down in South Carolina, right? Again, because of like a lot of the work of people in this room. But if you look at the statistics of who is reaching out for legal aid assistance or even like rental assistance, one, we know a lot of populations don't know that these programs are available. So one, like evictions again, like primarily affect women and parents of children, but actually single men are really underutilize services to help them. Whether that's pride or lack of awareness, I don't know. But also just like, kind of perversely, lower income people tend to have lower awareness of a lot of these programs. And I mean, they have greater need, but also they've got a lot going on in their lives. And maybe they didn't see in the news report that a new policy just passed and that they can take advantage of that. I mean, so I just think about how can we make all of the programs that we've already established that are already so effective work even better? And there's room to increase community awareness, and you have to think like, where are you going to run into these people? Given that the housing crisis is so concentrated in children, schools, pediatricians' offices, even like maternity wards, are like big opportunities to let people know about what housing resources are available to them.
So it's really about getting the information to them and then being intentional and maybe even a little creative about how you get that information to them so that they're aware of what resources are already available. And that's wonderful.
Jerry's gonna finish up whenever.
Oh, okay, yes. So we do have a hard stop at noon here in this room. So I am going to turn it over to Jerry to kind of close us out. I did see you in the back. I've got a couple minutes. So if there's a question that I can answer, or if Dr. Gershenson maybe has a little time.
I heard somebody ask about eviction ceiling, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody in the room knew that we have an eviction ceiling bill H 3270 that just got introduced. And so if you care about evictions, I'm with South Carolina Tenant Union, and y'all should actually come and ask some questions about that if y'all care about it and want to see some policy actually on country.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. To that note, the only other thing that I'll say about policy before I step down, because I know I can talk, is last year the Supreme Court the South Carolina Supreme Court ended up upholding the NAACP's housing advocacy program. And so that NAACP program lets non-lawyers provide limited housing resources and assistance to people facing eviction. So hopefully that is another resource that we can make sure to push to people. But with that, my time here is done. I thank you all so much, and I'll turn it over to you, Jerry.
Excuse my voice. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Jerry Kaynard, and I chair the board of directors for Charleston Pro Bono. And first, I want to thank all of you for coming today. Many of you are frontline providers of service. You know exactly what the statistics show, dealing with it every day. And I think all of you are to get a round of applause. So, second, I'd like to say that I'm very proud of what we do at Charleston Pro Bono, how we serve tenants who are facing eviction. I'd like for all the Charleston Pro Bono staff and our Ackerman fellows, some of our interns, to stand and be recognized. Would y'all please stand? And I want to thank Professor Gershenson for coming. You know, as we are in court representing our clients, trying to stop evictions and trying to provide resources, we always need information. We always need other resources that we don't have in order to get that job done. And I like to quote this famous physicist, David Deutsch, who said, "Everything that is not forbidden by laws of nature is achievable, given the right knowledge." Well, the Eviction Lab and Professor Gershenson are giving us that knowledge. So, thank you for coming. So, I hope that we get to do this and more in the future. I'm very encouraged by the turnout and those of you who are participating in housing. I want to recognize someone I've worked with for more than 20 plus years. I don't even remember how many years. Giona Shaw Johnson with the City of Charleston Housing with the City of Charleston. And Aris, I want to thank you. You mentioned, your situation, and only because you mentioned it, what people don't assume your compensation and what your issues are. The Housing Authority has got a gem in having you as general counsel. The community is really so much better off having you there. Thank you.